There we go. Kia ora. Welcome to 2025 RaC Guild. Nice to have you all here. Hope you had a fantastic break. We had a bit of an extended one. So our last session was in December, and then we took January off because New Zealand goes on holiday in January. So does Australia a little bit. Most of the time. So we're in Town Hall number 9. Can't believe we got to number 9, almost in double digits, and ready for a big year. So many changes happening all around the world in governments. Ideas about putting the entire budget of the US on the blockchain, I heard on the news this morning. Fascinating. I look forward to hearing what Tom and Hamish have to tell us this morning, who are our guests and presenters from Syncopate, which is based here in New Zealand. I think that everybody in the room probably knows Hamish and Tom, but I'll let you guys introduce for the video and for everybody watching this later on, a little bit about yourselves, and then the work that you've done and how you've come to Rules as Code, and about Syncopate Lab. That would be really great. And then we'll have a little time for some questions after your presentation, I hope, and then finish nice and promptly at about 5 to the hours. Give a chance for everybody to say goodbye, and that'll be us. So, out of you two, who'd like to start? Tom, you're on screen on the slide.
Yep.
If you wouldn't mind, take it away.
Cool. Thanks, Joe.
No worries.
So I'll just share my screen. Share now, share screen. Try not to share your faces back at you. And I think we're all good. Yeah, everybody can see that? Cool.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone for popping along and giving us the opportunity to talk about kind of two things. So one is the approach that Hamish and I have taken to understanding the space of rules as code, and kind of framing that a little bit more as something that we think of as digital legal systems. I'm going to explain a little bit about why we think of it in that way. And give you an example of how that sort of plays out with a system that is actually in sort of operational use, which is pretty cool. So, and then what we're going to do is explain from that sort of conceptual framework that has been informed by the research we've done, the development that Hamish has done, and our experience working in the public sector and sort of advising on a sort of tech regulation kind of basis. We're going to explain how that sort of conceptual approach is manifested through this product that we've developed, which is called DocRef. And Hamish is going to give you a demo of the DocRef platform and share a little bit of information about how it works and where it fits into that overall digital legal systems space. So a little bit of context on us. I think probably I have met everybody on the call at the moment, but for the audience at home. So my name's Tom. I've got a background in law and public policy. So I've been working in that space for more than a decade now, which is kind of crazy. A lot of my approach to this space is informed by early experience at university and coming straight out of university of helping people navigate dispute resolution systems and helping people navigate essentially social welfare systems. And by that, I mean specifically New Zealand's ACC system, which administers cover and entitlements for personal injury related stuff. So since doing that work, I've been more involved in sort of tech regulation and tech policy. I have a think tank called the Brainbox Institute, which also does consultancy work. So a lot of my approach to this space is informed by that sort of tech regulation, tech policy stuff, and working with public and private clients, both domestically and internationally. Hamish, do you want to give a quick background to you at this point, or do you want me to run through for you?
Feel free to go for it. It's always interesting to hear someone else's perspective on yourself.
So here's the things I like about Hamish. Hamish has got a background in software development and implementation for sort of more than 20 years. He initially came to the space through Verb, which is a software company that sort of specialized in web development and also sort of product development for developing websites as well. So early sort of SaaS approaches to the web. Hamish's approach to this has been informed by work inside local government and central government. And I think one of the cool things about Hamish's experience, as with some of you on the call, I think, is that it's really been informed through the whole recent journey of the kind of rules as code area. So back to the kind of service innovation lab in the Department of Internal Affairs in Wellington in New Zealand, sort of being there and actually doing some of the early experiments where people were trying to convert law into code and finding it pretty awful. Like, it was a pretty tough experience. And so I became aware of Hamish's work through Twitter, as it then was, rest in peace, when he was tweeting about the digital structure of the Accident Compensation Act. And because I'd been working with the ACC system, I homed in on that and went, that's fascinating. What are you doing? Tell me about it. And then we worked on some public interest legal research funded by the Law Foundation in New Zealand, where we kind of took a critical look at the rules as code space, tried to put it in a bit of historical context, and basically concluded, look, there's a lot of merit to this, this overall area. We think this is kind of the future, but there's a certain way it needs to be done in order to preserve the rule of law, separation of powers, things like that. So the other thing I'll just point out about Hamish is that he has been doing some rules as code training around OpenFisca and also developing an OpenFisca, so that direct experience. And again, probably the common theme for both of us is we've worked outside, inside, and alongside government on various things. So we sort of bring that diverse perspective.
That's great. Thanks, Tom.
Nice. So we articulated our approach to this rules as code space first in our sort of Law Foundation report back in 2021, but that was pretty long, it was pretty detailed, it was pretty New Zealand focused. So we have rehashed some of that with the benefit of work since, and this other report, Governing Digital Legal Systems. That was published in the MIT Computational Law Review, which was very exciting. Really cool publication doing all kinds of interesting stuff on computational law. And for those of you that are interested in reading it and making use of DocRef, we've actually published it using our DocRef system too. And as you'll see, what that means is that you can link to specific paragraphs of it, you can annotate it, you can tag it, you can do all kinds of cool stuff with it as a document. The key part of our approach to the kind of rules as code space is, as I mentioned, we think about it as a bigger question of how you take a range of different laws, regulations, other kinds of documents, and then you get them into some kind of form that you can use in a digital system, including through implementing it as code if you want to. However, what we've found over time is that one of the missing pieces with rules as code is frequently you're dealing with a range of different instruments. So some of the prior experience have been a matter of sitting there and working through line by line through the Social Security Act. That's really tough. For anybody who's done it, it's a really, really difficult exercise. And so what you wind up doing is actually needing to take account of an array of different instruments and formulating your own interpretation of how that works in a particular context. That is kind of a limitation of law as code or rules as code, because it means that whatever you're creating is not the law. So that kind of knocks some of the shine off the law as code space, but it's actually quite liberating too. And I know Jason's on the call. I was really inspired by his conclusion in his master's that just because it's an interpretation doesn't mean it's not useful. All law is an interpretation. What you then need to do is you need to think about the way that your interpretation can be shown to be reliable and valid and can be updated over time as necessary. So that's really been a focus for us. is how do we establish the systems necessary for basically working systematically from a range of different legal sources to a particular digital system in a particular context in a way that you can then trace back, you can audit, and importantly, you can maintain over time. The example that we have of this is some work that we did with Taumata Arawai, which is the drinking water regulator in New Zealand. The core thing that they needed to do is they needed to have drinking water suppliers measuring water for particular things at particular intervals, assessing whether they're in certain bands, then basically reporting that data to the regulator, who would do a similar exercise. So very computational type policy, right? It's basically measuring, counting, reporting. What they needed to do was have a reporting structure that made sense and reflected what was in the law. And they needed to enable that reporting via API. So what we did is we took this, I think my slides are out of order, that's why I'm getting confused. We took something that looks like this, right? So this is a PDF of the rules. It's 70 something pages, 80 something pages, and it's full of tables that look like this. And it's also broken down into modules. So the drafter had already tried to kind of get at this kind of computational nature of the rule set, but the way that the rules had been drafted hadn't been tested in that context. And it also, you know, it's all in a PDF. So what do we do with this now? Essentially, there was a lot of sort of copying and pasting required to get the information from here into another format. That is sort of what we wound up doing. I'm going to have to do some live remixing of slides. So what we wound up doing is essentially that. We took the information from the PDF and we put it into a simple data format. So this is just a CSV file. Again, this illustrates that there's a range of digital tools for the job that you can be using. It doesn't have to be jumping towards code immediately. What this let us do is filter, sort, and sort of work with the rules as data. And then another sort of critical part of the work that we were doing was adding these unique identifiers. So you might be able to see on my screen, my mouse in the left-hand column. We had to add a huge number of unique identifiers to the rule set because, for example, there would be parameters and tables with no way to say this is this row in this table. Even worse, it was sort of wholly unnumbered paragraphs, right? So there'd be a rule in a paragraph somewhere, and the best I could do in order to sort of trace you back to it was to say, if you go to page 6 and about halfway down, there's a paragraph that says blah, 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 blah. That was the only way we had to actually trace things back, which is problematic for us, given our approach to the rules as code.
Just to answer your question, Joe, we did need to do it manually. And as part of that process, we had to make decisions around what the actual intent was of the rules, because there were situations where the document gave multiple answers to the same question. So it might say it was 3 months in this place, and in another part of the document it would say it was 6 months for the same reporting period or something like that. And so we had to work out what the pattern was that had been in the drafter's head when they made it. And we ended up documenting every single one of those data points, where we extracted it from, and whether it was a direct translation or a direct interpretation, or whether we had or whether it was undecided or they needed clarification from the policy team, or whether it was just a straight contradiction. And so by the time we finished, we had a complete data set that showed everywhere where our data set was also inconsistent from the document. So they were then able to issue clarifications around those particular data points.
And this is sort of an example of what Hamish is talking about. So you had these drinking water quality assurance rules in this one PDF, but above that, there was another piece of legislation that actually empowered the drinking water quality assurance rules. And then a lot of the detail required to actually understand the context was in another set of standards, which were again in another set of tables, which were kind of inaccessible to computer systems. So for example, all of the values and measurements for how you're meant to measure things, whether it's in sort of milliliters or parts per gram or something like that, or in a totally different legal instrument. So it wasn't a case where you could actually just sit and look at the rules themselves and fully understand everything you had to do. You have to go and look at a range of different instruments. With the, I'll just finish up what we sort of did with the rules, and then we can do some questions. There were basically two digital outputs from what we did, from having worked with the rules. And we wouldn't do this the same way again in future. We would use DocRef for this if we were to do it again, to cut out a whole chunk of that middle layer. There were two outputs. One is this rule builder and kind of rules navigator system, which Hamish pulled together. The cool thing about this is the whole sort of data backend for it is a series of CSV files. So the source of the rules is something that any non-technical person in a government agency can dive into and update the fields. So that means that there's no technical barriers to the maintenance of things like this over time. This is a rule builder that essentially lets you jump in, say, I belong in this category, and then it tells you which rules you need to comply with in the modules. But equally, it can be used to generate other digital outputs like these SQL statements that update based on the input provided by the user. And then it also gives you an example report for a particular field that you're reporting against. And this report structure down the bottom reflects the work that we did to go from understanding the nature of the rules through to the data systems required to make sure that basically all the relevant information can be entered in the right field in the right format in order to actually be used for analysis stuff within Taumata Arawai itself. And then we also have these pages too. So these pages basically present you dynamically with the information you need in relation to a particular thing. So rather than having to go away and pass through this whole PDF and sort of pull it all apart yourself, you get this much more sort of tailored, curated view of the rules that are relevant to you. And again, you can probably see how for an agency to go from here are all the rules, you work it out, to these are the rules that we say apply to you is quite a significant step in terms of saying, you know, it's essentially giving guidance at that point rather than just publishing law. So the ability to explain the link between those two things is really important. I'm all out of order, but I think I'll sort of sum up here and then we could either do some questions or Hamish could sort of clarify and take us through to DocRef itself. You know, the key takeaways is that you've got multiple, when you're working with implementing law in digital systems, you're going to be working with multiple sources of law and regulation. I haven't found the area yet where you can just sort of tie a neat bow around 1 to 2 bits of law that are fully self-sufficient. There's always a need to go out somewhere else to try and understand how the law actually works. Depending on what you're actually doing in the context, the digital outputs you require might be really diverse. So it's not just that you need to jump to OpenFisca or Català or Blocks or any of the other really useful frameworks for implementing your interpretation once you've derived it. It might be as simple as CSV files. And that might be all you need to basically interact with the law in digital formats in more useful ways. And again, the actual implementation here for us was an API, right? So it was an API that was ready to receive the kinds of data required and could be used by external software providers to report against the rules. The other thing about this is that it's an example that's actually in production. So this is being used by Taumata Arawai. It's being used by water suppliers in New Zealand, and it's also the basis for doing some analysis of the data that's being reported to assess compliance. One of our big takeaways from this is, as Hamish identified, there were sort of things that we had to go and clarify in the process of working out this rule set. One of the core takeaways from the early sort of better rules work in New Zealand, which we found, we relearned again, is that if you have the opportunity to get into the sort of policy design space and into the drafting space, well before you ever get into the actual implementation of the rules, you can fix so many of those issues and you can make life much easier. So the big opportunity is to try and get upstream into that policy development space. And we're thinking about tooling and other things for doing that. If you're doing that, you get much greater potential for basically direct digital implementation. So you can sort of cut out some of that interpretive work because you might have just machine executable formats, i.e. CSV or tables that are actually accessible, directly implemented into particular systems. And we see a really big potential for this kind of system. And as we've pointed to here, we're basically talking about a regulatory reporting system. So if you think about across government, how many different regulatory regimes involve people reporting stuff back to the government, usually using digital systems, that's a really big area to potentially work with. I think I've gone a little bit over time, so I want to pass over to Hamish to pick up on some of the DocRef stuff. You good with that?
Yeah, no, that's cool. I'll just finish off what you're talking about. I've done some work with the central government agencies trying to deal with reported data from regulatory systems in the past. And the, shall we say, normal way that it's done currently is that the PDF or the secondary regulation that describes the reporting environment is published, and then each of the parties involved in having to respond to that interpret it themselves and then supply a data model based on their own interpretation back to, if they're lucky to get data, it could be all documents. But then the agency charged with like dealing with these reports and the like now have a very difficult task of trying to compile and understand what the similarities are between these reports and whether these values in this report are equivalent to these values in this report. So it becomes very difficult for them to produce a unified output. And I've spent time working with agencies spacing that specific problem, working with departments. So what's interesting with this model is when you have asked the department to provide a digital API for people to report against, they're having to go into new territory. They're having to now interpret their own rule set as opposed to that job that was normally done by all of the regulated parties. And so we talk about this a bit in our paper on governing digital legal systems, but this idea for them initially is that it's a very risky undertaking because now they're saying what their law means as opposed to letting everybody else decide. And that's where I think there's a real nice tie over between the likes of these open source approaches to building out rule models or of code or of law, whereby you allow for feedback mechanisms, you allow for versioning, and you create this culture of, yes, it's an interpretation and it will evolve. And it's not meant to be, it can't be perfect, it can be the current best understanding of the situation. And so allowing people to challenge it and creating that type of atmosphere around this type of work, I think is the next challenge, because the departments themselves generally freak out at this point and don't want to show their working and don't want to show how they got to where they got to. So just be aware of that as an approach. If I share my screen, when we did this LDL, by the way, the CSV files, I'll just make a wee pitch here for base file formats, are very much like plain text files and CSV files and code files, if you will, mainly from the perspective of nobody can lock you out of those. They're going to last for decades. They may last for as long as we have computers. And so the CSV files that we develop for this as our interpretive work, this site is generated via scripts just from the CSV file. So if we update the CSV file, we just push a button and the new documentation site was deployed. It's the same for the API endpoints that we didn't develop, but they're running off our same CSV files. And then somebody in the department can just go and open that CSV file in Excel as well. So really like this idea of this lowest common denominator and working with plain text files as a general methodology and approach to thinking about some of these things. I'll get into DocRef. So the initial thinking behind DocRef was in a blog post I wrote of some time back called "A Love Letter to the Parliamentary Councils of the World," and it was looking at this idea of, while I was doing work in Open Fisca back in the day on the New Zealand Social Security Act, this is like back in 2018, 2019, the ability to reference the legislation within the code base so that we could maintain it was difficult. And while the New Zealand legislation site had links and anchors that you could investigate and find, they weren't granular enough, and there was no guarantee that they were permanent in any sense. So you didn't know, even if you were using those references, that it was going to work. And I'm talking about references within the document as opposed to the document itself, but also referencing the document itself was problematic. And it still is to this day with the legislation site, because they publish the latest version of a document as the latest version that has the latest in the URL. And so if you tag your code with that, and then it gets updated a few versions later, when you come back and look at your code base, you've got no idea which version this was coded against. And so you've got a real maintenance problem. That maintenance of rules as code systems has been my underlying inspiration for all of this work. You know how hard it is to do the interpretive work and build the model and build the tests and get it working. You don't want to have to keep doing that from scratch every time. You want to work out how you can maintain these over time, because we know that the natural language rule sets will be changing. So I wrote this love letter blog post along with a demonstration of what I was talking about, where I took a bunch of New Zealand law XML and reprocessed it so that it had these unique identifiers, and then reproduced it on my blog, just to sort of say, see, we can do this with what we have. It's not that hard. Turned out it is that hard, and it is quite an ask for anybody to do. And so thinking about that as a problem that does this need solving is how we ended up looking at this more from the perspective of, is this a service that actually needs to exist? Because we're asking too much of people to be able to say, yes, you can do this. So docref.org is where this has all ended up. There is a developing standard underneath it, which we call the Love Letter Standard, which is the format and approach we took. We've since been processing XML files from New Zealand law and from European law. And we've also been developing a third way, which is allowing us to produce these documents from plain text files, because I quite like plain text files. And I think they've got the longest shelf life. So that was, initially this work was done as just a proof. This is possible. This is what we should do. We also have a saying that we haven't invented the wheel here. We've just made the wheels we've got turn, because a lot of this stuff is just HTML and internet stuff, you know, and that it has existed. And another saying we have is publishing your documents on PDF on the internet is like buying a horse and then taking it for a walk with the lead around the block, as opposed to riding it. You've got so much more capability that you could be making use of. So for an initial, how about I use the live version? We have a group of documents here. I just want to look at the Social Security Act first, since it's relevant to work that people on this call have been working on.
Might be good to just zoom in a couple of notches, Hamish.
Let's zoom in. Is that better? Is light mode a bit better for a call? Is that a bit easier for everybody? I should have brought my sunglasses. So this is one of the documents that I've spent the most time on. You can get a sense of how big this document is in terms of sheer text content. This is the and just how much like there is in the schedules as well for this. This is the New Zealand Social Security Act, and it has a lot of rules around the benefit system and things within New Zealand. Of course, I've gone to the effort of creating all of the versions of this since it was first published in 2018 as the 2018 version. I don't know, actually. When I say that, I still have no automated system for the latest updates, and I know that there's been work being done, so I should actually check at some point and see if 230 is still the latest. It may need updating. But this document is now made up of all of these blocks, and these blocks all have a unique identifier associated with them that you can see when you click on them. It's quite granular. If we have, it lets you link to like table cells and table rows as well, or lines of code, because we can reproduce code in the document as well. I haven't actually presented this for a while, Tom, so if you feel like you need to interrupt at some point and take over, you're more than welcome. Underneath this is a data set, and that data set is what we derive this content from in an HTML form. It doesn't need to be in an HTML form. This is just us trying to convey to people that this is still a valid document and that looks like a document and what you'd expect from a document. But it could be a CSV file. You can download a CSV file of it, and where you've got all the references and all of the content, and you could work with that in your systems that you're working with. It also has an API endpoint, because once you have a data set like this, you can call it from an API endpoint. And the nature of that data set as well is that it's flat. It's not embedded like the content of the document. It's a sequential data set. And so you can make that very easily available via API, which allows for all sorts of really interesting use cases that are yet to be demonstrated. As well as some of the ones that I have in the past, and those demonstrations are no longer with us. These unique identifiers are useful, but they also need to be tied to the URL, because the URL is where we pick up on what the version of the document is. So if I skip back to this LDL, one of the things that amused me about this when I revisited it recently is the very first link on this in this library is to the Drinking Water Quality Assurance Rules PDF on the Talmud.ro website. But it so happens that since we published that, they've moved that. And so that link no longer works, which is one of the problems in terms of like infrastructure, especially at the secondary regulation level. And so the point of this is that once you publish this document in that version that is done, you don't touch it again. When the new version comes out, you also publish that. And so there's a sense of taking quite a long-term view of this, so that your rules as code systems are able to reference the specific versions, and then when a new version comes out, you can take a more methodical approach to the upgrade. To show you what that looks like, because everything's a unique ID, we can diff documents. And we can diff documents not like you do in Word or in code, where you run an algorithm over the two pieces and it does its best to try and sum up and stack up what's changed. We can do it at a block level, which means we can say this particular block no longer exists, or this particular block is now called this, or this particular block has been merged into these two blocks, or these three blocks are now this block. You've got that sort of functionality, and for this diff, because obviously this is also a huge document, you're like, what's changed? So we've added a filter that lets us go, this is everything that changed in the last version update. And what we can see here is essentially they just changed the amounts in the tables at the very end of the benefits, as they do once or twice a year, generally. And so now, if you can imagine, this is a table cell and we have a link to that. When we're working in OpenFisco, we can now take that URL, well, not that particular URL because we're currently in a compare, but if you have that that identifier in your system, we are also able to produce a programmatic change log of all of these changes. So, and behind the scenes here is another JSON file that is telling us what's changed, what's renamed, what's removed, and what's added, and what's just got a diff on it, like what one has just had the text changed. And so a lot of that you could start to automate in terms of utilizing that file to run over your code base to find out, these are the areas that we need to focus on, and using that as a starting position. On a document of this size, that's just really important. Like currently, when a new version of the Social Security Act drops in the legislation gov.nz site, you've got to go and try and find the bills that or orders that brought into effect the changes. It's not easy to track everything down to get a sense of like categorically knowing that you're across it. So that's the diff is probably the first best example from a rules of code perspective of some of the value here that we can derive from approaching documents this way. In the work that Tom and I do, he says, just checking time. When I first demonstrated this or talked this through with Tom, Tom was like, oh, I've got uses for this, which were different to my uses, and that sense of coming at it from a policy perspective. So do you want to demonstrate, Tom, perhaps the annotation tool and your use of that? I'll let you screen share.
I'll jump to the, just in terms of time, maybe I'll jump to the DIA vision as well.
Oh, yeah, cool.
Okay. So let me just bring up what we've been doing. We do want to make sure we've got some time for questions at the end too. So in terms of understanding how this might fit into a digital legal context or just a sort of broader policy context, this is something we're working on with the New Zealand Department of Internal Affairs at the moment. It is still in an alpha state, so it's not sort of authoritative at this point, but we hope to get there soon. What DIA is doing is, as part of a broader sort of service modernization program within government, they want to enhance or increase the uptake of APIs across government for data sharing and building shared services and things. As part of that, there are a set of guidelines called the API guidelines that were published in 2022. The guidelines are broken down into 3 parts, Part A, Part B, Part C. And you can see there's also some sort of contextual pages, right? So there's a really brief sort of landing page about APIs and then about the API guidelines. Each of these documents is available, as Hamish mentioned, in that sort of HTML format as an API endpoint, and then as a CSV download as well. So you can sort of take all of the stuff with you. The purpose of putting them into this format is twofold. I'm going to take you to Part C too, because that's where all the cool features are. So Part C is for developers. It's meant to be super technical, and it's got a bunch of code examples in it. What is happening is there's a review committee from across government who are using DocRef to review the API guidelines. And the way that they're doing that is by using our annotation tool. So if you click on a block, you press enter on your keyboard, or you press the little feather or quill button down the bottom. The annotation tool pops up, you set an author name, and you say, this is a great paragraph, and then start adding some tags. And then you save the annotation locally with your keyboard as well. The annotations are currently just stored as a local file in your browser. So super private, super local, quite good for policy work. Where we're going next is cloud-based, sort of real-time collaboration type stuff. So that's something we'll be doing soon. The annotations are really easy to edit. You just click them and then you update them like that. And you can start filtering by these tags immediately. So one of the things I'm sure you've experienced doing rules as code stuff is you need sort of a working view of the document that you're working on, right? So you're sort of pulling chunks out and you just want to work on that particular chunk. You don't want to look at the whole Social Security Act the whole time. So there's tags that you start to filter by subject or by whatever else you might need. You know, one of the examples for us has been linking it to particular API design things, for example. Go for it.
I recently, my most recent work I did on the Social Security Act, I actually went through the regulations and tagged up the regulations with one of the benefits, two of the benefits I was working on, so that I read it once, tagged as I went, and from then on, I didn't have to keep scrolling through the document. I could be just working from those, from that key view that I created on it. Yeah,
and what we can also do there is publish the annotation sets. So if Hamish was working with somebody else, then they can access this annotation set too, to wrap their head around what's been done. The annotation tool, I mentioned it's sort of stored locally at the moment. You can export your annotation set. So we were working on our DocRef user guide, and we needed to sort of review some stuff, and it was in DocRef format. So what I could do is I could go through and tag paragraphs, and I could say, this needs a rewrite, this needs an edit, there's an error here. And then I could add annotations to describe what was actually wrong with the document. Then I could export the annotation set, email it to Hamish, and he could go and make the changes to the document on his side. So it enables this kind of collaboration ability, as well as the ability to store the annotation sets for sort of public records purposes and things like that. Obviously, there's also the ability to import on the other side as well. So you just import a local file and then it pops into your browser. The other purpose of having these API guidelines in this format is to be able to include in downstream API design or in other kind of policy documents referring to the guidelines, the links to specific bits. So for example, if another agency is designing its own guidelines and wants to refer back to the authoritative guidelines, it can do that through threading these URLs through the thing. When the new API guidelines publish too, there'll be the ability to diff and see what's changed between them. The last thing I'll show you just in terms of the kind of granularity that we've achieved is we have these unique identifiers for stuff like these drop downs or for an image or to a bullet point. And one of the really cool ones that Hamish mentioned is to lines and code examples as well. So you can point specifically back to a code example, or you can share it and you can discuss it in that kind of way. I think that's pretty much it in terms of all the features that we're going to show. And I'm sure there are a bunch of questions, technical or conceptual or otherwise. So why don't we leave it there and then we can leave the rest for questions, unless there's anything you want to round out, Hamish.
Perhaps just we are taking this to the point where we will be able to, you'll be able to sign up and utilize it as a service, input your own documents, annotate those, publish those, work with others on those, and white label it as we're doing here with the Department of Internal Affairs.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Joe, do you want to sort of facilitate questions, or
sure.
I don't know what the tikanga is, so just jump in.
Sure. First of all, thanks very much, guys, and what an amazing amount of work you guys have been doing in 2023 and 2024 to get to this point. Mind-blowing from where we were a few years ago. Thank you for all of that hard work. I think Jaden had a question first, sort of halfway through. Jaden, does that question still occur to you?
No, not really. That was more of a looking at discretionary clauses, but this is kind of further on from rules as code, where we're converting the whole thing and we're looking at paragraphs. And no, I think I would love to hear some other questions first.
Cool. Kurt, I think you're up next.
Yeah, firstly, this is fantastic because legislation is incredibly difficult to interrogate. Hamish, you mentioned a little while ago that policy people in government never want to actually explain how they got to where they got to. Having just left government, it is amazing how often legislation does not actually work together. Having needed to operationalize legislation when you're talking about 3 or 4 different acts, we never want to say how we got to the conclusion because it's not actually the legislation. Basically, the best interpretation we can do in an operational sense. So I have got a couple of questions. I'll just do one now in case other people have got questions. In Australia, I know in Victoria in particular, we've got annotations quite regularly throughout legislation. So there's little call outs on the legislation. Are you guys
yeah, like the
taking
notes,
care of
yes.
those? Yeah, you guys have got that catered for already as well?
We'd probably treat them like footnotes, but if they are separate from the footnotes as well, then we could have a look at how we incorporate that into our standard. Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't got them yet, but basically it's just a matter of putting some time into it and pulling them in. It's sort of the, you know, the like version history notes, that kind of thing is what you're talking about, I think. Yeah.
So there's a whole bunch of legislation in Victoria, particularly quite old legislation, where parts of the Act are actually little call-outs that are separate to the rest of the legislation that kind of refer back to other parts of it.
Yeah, right.
And when we were building the legislation website here, it was actually really quite difficult to deal with because I wanted
Are they
to move.
in the sidebar type of?
Yeah,
visual?
they're kind of in the sidebar. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know
Yeah.
if that's a uniquely Australian thing or not, but
I think there is this really, like, we've done some work with the New Zealand Parliamentary Council as well, and there's this other upstream component which is publishing in formats that make it easy for us to do this with it. And you know, on the social security example, you might have seen there's a table and there's all these arrows at the top, and that's because there's all these empty columns that have been used for spacing and layout purposes that you don't see visually, but you do see in an XML dataset. So there's this really interesting sort of question about how you can get better upstream publishing practices to make the sort of data sets more useful.
Those extra columns, just to be clear, in the XML they publish. And so it's quite amusing to me as an old school web developer that we're dealing with table-based layout problems again, but this time in XML in 2025.
We might move on to Jason. You got a question? Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
I was two questions actually. One, I'm wondering what the licensing is, and two, I'm wondering if it's possible to kind of add custom fields to the individual blocks if you have other things that you want to record.
The licensing for we're developing two standards. One I haven't talked about. Our goal is to open source those once we're confident with the formalization process. And we've got to a point of rigor that we're like very comfortable with. Because it's all low-level data elements, yes, it's really extensible. It'd be it's a walk in the park to like build extensions or plugins or develop it however you will.
Yeah, and probably just, Jason, in the short term, the licensing is like proprietary. We need to recover some revenue from it, but we're still exploring what that needs to look like for, particularly, you know, one of the interesting things that's come from chatting to potential customers in the last year or so is that there is a significant potential customer base around developers. So people wanting to basically, for example, access the API. So we're basically working out how that would work. So keen to chat more about that.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jason.
SP Rocket is the handle. What's your question?
Michael.
Michael.
Okay, Michael Prone from Department of Finance in Canberra. I'm sort of intrigued with the sort of two things. One's the content sort of sharing piece of having unique identifiers, and you mentioned the love letter standard, and I'm just wondering where you see that fitting in sort of a broader schema around metadata. Is it? You just want to talk about that for a moment?
A lot of what we are leaning on is core internet infrastructure, and so the use of those unique identifiers in the URL as anchor tags is nothing new, other than the systematic approach to the production of those unique identifiers. The unique identifiers themselves are completely customizable. As you may have noticed in amongst the demonstration, some of the documents had like just, you know, P2-6, P6 or something like that, and other ones had paragraph 2-. So it's up to the document authors how they construct those. The identifiers themselves are also hierarchical, so you can break the identifier at any point in the dash, and you will get a selection of blocks returned at that point if there are children of that. So it's meant to be allowing you to serve up a part or a section or an article as a whole, as opposed to an individual block. The way it fits into existing standards is probably fairly elementary in that sense that, again, it's just using the URL. And so when we have built the API endpoints in the past, we have used that same hierarchical model. So it might be, say, API / part 4 / article 3 / paragraph 2. And so at this point, you now can navigate the API endpoints and retrieve the data directly from the same unique identifier system that you are seeing visually on the document or looking at in the CSV file. Whether that needs to be, I don't see how that needs to be formalized into a standard. It's like a way of working that works with the existing standards.
Yeah. All right. The other question I got, just in a totally different part of the system, like you have an existing OpenFISCA calculation or rules engine. I mean, nothing you're doing here is allowing you to update rules. I'm thinking of non-programmers updating rules in sort of an existing rules engine. The question.
Yeah, so I'm just pulling up on my screen so I can share. It might take a bit long, but in our OpenFISCA instance for the OpenFISCA Aotearoa project, we've started using these tags within the code base as references. So it is meant to be forming that bridge between the natural language rules and the code interpretation.
Okay.
We think that the two need to, in our research, we established that we're not going to lose natural language rules. They need to they need to retain for serious constitutional reasons. And so finding a way to tie the code directly to those natural language rules is the problem that's trying to be solved.
Yeah.
Here. And this is that.
Okay, now I understand it. Thank you.
Kurt, if you can keep it brief-ish.
Oh, yes. Okay. I'll be as brief as I can. It's mainly just around the hosting. So completely get it. If you guys are doing cost recovery, that is very sensible. Do you have like security certifications around the hosting solution you guys have, the proprietary one now? And then I'm assuming when in future you become open source, it'd be a self-hosting option available as well.
Yeah, there's two components in terms of deployment that is maybe of interest. The first is because these are documents that you don't want to change and you want to be permanent. We've designed the base DocRef system to actually be a static site. So it's a low tech, much like my love of CSV files and the like. We're talking HTML files sitting on a server because you don't intend them to be edited once they're it's not like a CMS. It's not meant to be like a CMS in that sense. The functionality and the like that go over the top of that, we're working towards SOC 2 compliance across all of that stack. Yeah, it's that's our intention, is to take that route.
A work in progress.
Yes.
Yeah, nice one. Another quick one. Are you guys wanting the news to be spread about this? I was just thinking about emailing a couple of folks in VicGov.
Yeah.
Yeah, more than welcome
great.
to. Cool. Everything we've demonstrated is actually online as well. So if you pick up the URLs from the video, you can check them out.
Yeah, happy to organise another chat separately as well if you've got any other questions.
We'll add all of the details with your guys' permission and references to the RaC Guild website and newsletter and emails that we send out. And so, yes, expect a few calls, a few calls and emails. Thank you so much, not just for coming and presenting, but for for all that hard work. I have some idea of how much was involved, but I'm sure not entirely. It's amazing. There's a million more questions I have, particularly tied to digital identity.
Yeah,
and the, you know, but
that's one of the next ones off the block, Joe, in terms of our previous work. So yeah, digital identity. Awesome. Watch this space.
Excellent. Look forward to connecting with you on that one. Thank you very much. This has been a great session. I'm sure you will get a lot of people who are watching this and coming back to you with lots more questions. So for today, have a great one. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you everybody for coming and for your insightful questions. And we look forward to seeing you on the first Wednesday of March, which will be our first double digits RaC Guild session, number 10. Look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much indeed.